Yeah, that's more the county parks and rec. And I think Page got some.
Yeah, but
30 seconds.
yeah, I've been a volunteer on the Master Gardener program. They've got an acre out there.
30 seconds. Commissioner Alan Brandt is here. So, okay, we'll start. Okay, good evening, everyone. May I have your attention, please? There is a, what they say in the Pentagon, there's a fire in the building?
Absolutely not.
Hello, folks. My name is, I'm sorry. Let me get myself ready here. Turn this on. See if it works. Okay. I'm Ian Thomas. I am from the Army BRAC office in Washington, D.C., the Pentagon. I am the program manager for the remediation effort here at the former Sunflower Army Ammunition Plant. And today I'd like to give you an update as to where we are in that remediation effort to clean up the former military installation. I want to thank you all for attending tonight's meeting, public meeting. And just a quick admin announcement. If you have your cell phones or any electronic devices, you put those on mute, please. And also the bathrooms are out those double doors there. You make 3 lefts, and they're both male and female at the 3rd left. At this time, we still have some folks that are signing in. So we'll give them about 30 seconds or so to finish their sign-in, and then we'll start the meeting. Is everyone doing okay today? Everyone looks okay. Good, good. Oh, it is? Oh, okay. Alrighty. All right. Again, good evening, folks. Again, my name is Ian Thomas, and I'm here to give you an update on our cleanup effort at Sunflower Ammunition Plant. Next slide. All right, so we're going to introduce the participants and organizations. To my left, this gentleman here is Mark Blair from the Army Environmental Command, and I'll let the other folks that are behind me introduce themselves. We do have one very important person in the back, and she'll introduce herself in a second.
Scott Smith, I'm the BRAC site manager out on Sunflower, and so I'm out there every day.
I'm with the U.S. Army Environment Command. Good evening, folks. I'm Dick Ramsfeld. I'm the Army's BRAC chief.
Andy Napoli, I'm the assistant for stationing at BRAC, and then Army headquarters installation section.
And in the back,
Here on the project manager, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
okay, we do have our support elements here taking care of the audio visual. Then they're both, all 3 on the left side. Okay, so the objectives we're going to go over briefly. And this is the agenda first and foremost. We're going to go over site remediation, the Army and the RCRA process, remediation and decontamination update and next steps, current status, contract update, and then we get questions on progress. We'll also jump into very briefly restoration advisory boards, and then we'll have additional questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Okay, the meeting objectives. I'm not going to read everything here, but I will highlight a few things, and first and foremost is to inform the public of the overall progress of the Army's remediation at Sunflower. And we'll provide you with a brief update on the status of the cleanup. Next. Okay, a little bit of background. Some of you have seen this before. We listed the installation as excess in 1997. So essentially, the mission that occurred for over 40 years, 50 years, ceased at that particular time. And we embarked on an effort to clean up the site and transfer it to make it available for redevelopment purposes. In 2005, we transferred the entire site to the Sunflower Redevelopment LLC, and we provided a significant sum of funding to execute the cleanup. That cleanup lasted for about 6 years. It completed about 50% of the explosive hazard remediation and about 25% of the environmental remediation. The Army came back in 2015 to execute the remainder of that cleanup once funds were expended and exhausted back in 2011. Since that time, we have awarded over 14 contracts valued at over $200 million. Next. Okay, so 3 organizations come together to execute this work. My office, the Army Environmental Command, and the Army Corps of Engineers. As you heard, each of those different elements provided a brief introduction earlier. So this is a very big undertaking, and we do have elements within the Army structure that is required to come together to execute the cleanup. Next. The Army's process for remediation is, for all intended purposes, governed by law. You know, there are statutes out there that dictate how we execute the work that's required and also execute the funding that is allotted to us by the federal government. We are working within the Defense Environmental Restoration Program to execute the environmental cleanup, and we have done explosive hazard decontamination work across the site, and most of that work initially, when we first started back in 2015, most of that work prevented concurrent environmental remediation. So the explosive hazard remediation, and as that word is submitted here today, explosive hazard, it's a safety hazard. We have to get that taken care of before we can do additional work at the site to get at the contamination that was left behind. Next slide. All right, this is a map with the various boundaries of Sunflower and the different response sites that we have. And around the room, we have several maps that identify where we were, where we are now, and where we will hope to end up once we complete the cleanup. So this first map here is the soil CMI, which CMI is the corrective measures implementation. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. And this schedule was for 2021. As you can see, map that identifies those response sites and the timing to which we expect that we would complete the cleanup. The other map you see over here is some of the work that was executed. The digging of foundations, the digging of sewers and things of that nature, and then obviously the completion. So this is the before, during, and after slides here. And at the end, you'll see the restoration effort that occurred once we were finished cleaning up that particular site. As it says here, AOC 16, nitrocellulose production lines, interim corrective measures. So that's a process that we used that was executed here at the site to produce nitrocellulose for making of the smokeless powder. In the back, that last slide, this slide here in the back, it identifies our efforts. At the end of 2023, we would have cleaned up. You see a lot of these boxed areas with no colors. So we have completed the work in that area. And the colored areas are work in areas that we still have left to do. So in contrast, 2023, 2021, we had a lot of sites that we were working on in 2021. We have completed a lot of those sites, and that's the status today where we're at. We still have a long way to go, but this is just a graphic depiction of the work that has been accomplished across the site. The next slide or picture over there, we'll talk a little bit more about that. That has to do with our efforts and get it to no further action, where the developer can then come in and do his work that's necessary to make this, to return this to a usable state. So bottom line on the redevelopment, our efforts here have to do with us getting approval from KDHE and EPA about the work that we've accomplished, and then the work that we no longer need to execute, but just to do the documentation to ensure that it can be removed from the permit. Next slide. Okay, so we talked a little bit about those different maps. And so here are some of the processes that we executed to get to where we are now. RCRA facility assessment conducted by the regulator to identify solid waste management units and units of concerns. RFI, the RCRA facility investigation, delineates nature and extent of the contamination. And the corrective it's the alternatives. The CMI implements the corrective action that was identified in the alternatives. And the statement of basis, this is a document that is done by the regulators that submits for public comment so that you all can weigh in on the effort at the site. And then we'll get no further corrective action plan. It's a KDHE requested document that facilitates site closeout and removal from the permit. The corrective action permit is that permit that we are operating under to clean up the site, so it's governed by the laws of Kansas. And process at this particular time. Okay, the RCRA corrective action permit application is complete and submitted to KDHE for adjudication. Once that is complete, we'll have a new permit that will identify the remainder of the work that we need to do. And it will also identify specifically to what levels we execute the cleanup at Sunflower. So the focus is now on completing the site-wide environmental remediation. As I indicated before, we completed the explosive hazard remediation. Took us about 7 years to do that. Started in 2015, about October, and we were complete with the explosive hazard remediation. We had 97 response sites, 97 sites. If you were able to do a quick count, you'll see every single one of these, all total 97 sites. We have closed 19 sites, and they require no further action, and they were removed from the RCRA permit. I do want to say one thing about the redevelopment that is occurring. while we're not responsible for development, these 19 sites that have been closed and have been removed from the RICRA permit, right, have been closed in this particular area here, which is called Sector F. And as you guys came into the site, well, folks have been passing the sunflower site over the last several months. You'll see a lot of construction going on. So the Panasonic Energy of North America is constructing their battery plant in that area that they bought from the landowner, which amounts to about 350 acres. So we essentially focused on this area to get it cleaned up because that area provided the best opportunities for redevelopment sooner rather than later. Okay, we have 14 additional sites awaiting no further action from the regulators, and we do have 62 sites remaining that we're currently continuing to do cleanup, and that we have some level of work has already been accomplished there. We do have 14 sites within the 62 sites that are waiting for documentation to be prepared so that we can submit that documentation, no further action documentation, to the regulator in order to get those sites approved, no further action, and also removed from the RICRA permit when the time is near. Next slide. Okay, we're going to go through some pictures here to show you some additional pictures of the remediation that occurred. And this is some of what we encountered at the site on the foundations and the footings. And this is nitrocellulose bulk explosive. So we had to, again, get at all of these explosive hazard that was here in the sewers, underneath the footings of the buildings, underneath the slabs or the foundations of the buildings. And once we got after this, removed all those things, flashed the debris, then we did the environmental sampling on the ground once we removed the concrete. So essentially, again, it bears repeating because it took us 7 years to do this. All of the explosive hazard that was present at the site has now been removed and adjudicated. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to go through a little bit of overview of contract completions. Zapata contract was the first contract that we awarded in 2015, and their responsibility was to get the explosive hazard on the internal sewers, which is the sewers that were directly underneath the foundations of the different buildings, and also to get after the foundations themselves and the explosive hazard that unfortunately during the production of nitrocellulose, nitroglycerin, and nitroguanidine that ended up underneath those foundations. So I won't go through this whole part of the information here, but I just want to point out the amount of work that was done under this contract. Cubic yards of concrete removed and neck piping removed. And these are all the different sites that this contract worked to clean up. Next slide, please. Some before and after slides or pictures. Building 5900 is that big concrete slab. And after the slab was removed, this is what you have. Same thing with building 2500, before and after. Next slide. More concrete. This is the restoration effort that occurred. And the second contract we awarded for explosive hazard remediation was by Sevenson USA. That was done in 2016. They had the responsibility to do foundations as well, but more so, they had the outside, the external sewers to do, the ones that ran onto the streets that we have, and in between the buildings, carrying all of that product from point A to point B and off to the pond. So physically complete, this contract is 100% physically complete. Removed 254,000 square feet of building foundations. They did do some limited amount of inside sewer lines. The outside sewer lines totaled 138,000 linear feet. And restoration is complete in all areas. Next slide. Again, graphic depiction of some of the work that was done. Right here we have deep acid sewer trench after pipe removal. But the difficulty here is you have a layer of pipe there, a layer of pipe there, and a layer of pipe there. So there are 3 different layers of pipe running, across the entire installation in some areas. Single layers in some areas, but triple layers in. Next slide. Just some more graphic depiction of the work that was done and the piping that had to be removed. Next slide. So some more different areas, SHME 26, sewer removal, and the restoration. So before, during, and after. Next slide. And we had a third explosive hazard remediation contract. This one completed the end of January, first part of January. Right now, all they're doing essentially is just completing reports for this contract. 28,000 linear feet of sewer lines, 400,000 square feet of concrete foundations were removed by this contract. Next slide. Just one more before and after. AOC 16, it's a large area here, all the different types of work that was being done. You had sewers, foundations, and this is the restoration after that work was accomplished. Next slide. Okay, this is the overall summary of the explosive hazard remediation, and this encompasses as well the work that was done by the landowner in 2005 to 2011. So all told, over 4 million, almost 5 million square feet of concrete was removed, and over 225,000 linear feet of sewer pipes were also removed. Again, explosive hazard remediation is complete, and so we can concentrate on the entire site to do environmental remediation to finish that cleanup. We have, in general, about 5 additional years remaining in order to do that work. Next slide. Okay. I indicated earlier that we have 14 contracts that we have awarded over the years, totaling over $200 million, excuse me. This is just a snapshot of the work that some of these contracts were responsible for. Lewis Berger in 2015, documentation. You can't do any remediation without documentation. Also, you can't really do any remediation without sampling and ensuring that you are getting after what's there. You know what's there, number one, you delineate, and number two, you get after a process that takes care of the removal. These 2 contracts started out very early. These 3 contracts started out very early, as you can see, in 2015. And all of these contracts, the work has been completed. Next slide. We just talked about the Sevenson USA 2016 contract. That work is complete. Additional documentation. Again, we have 97 sites that we needed to address and document that the work is complete. Lewis Berger again got a contract in 2017. That work is complete. AECom again had somewhat the similar contract in 2018. That work is complete. Next slide. Cape Envamo, another contract. This one here is to perform the RCRA corrective measures implementation. Right, this is where they actually go out and dig and haul and sample and execute completion reports. This work is complete from this 2018 contract. Lewis Berger 2019, additional documentation contract. And as you can see here, all of the work here for these documents will be completed by September of 23. This next contract that we just talked about, it's the third explosive decontamination contract. That work is complete and only the reporting remains. Sewer lines, foundations. Next slide. We had a contract 3 years ago with a joint venture, SRS Cape 2020. Again, additional corrective measures implementation. This work is also complete. AECom was successful in winning a task order for additional corrective measures study and RCRA facility investigation. 27 sites on the contract. This work is about 60%. Next slide. Another contract that was awarded in 2021. Cape Environmental again. Additional CMI. And this work is 80% complete. One of Kansas's local firms, Burns and McDonnell. This is a contract that was awarded to them. Pretty large task order, 48 sites. Continued investigation of the groundwater site-wide. Prepare the application for the RCRA permit that was submitted. And this work is 40% complete. Next slide. Okay, so here, this bullet indicates that we have awarded a contract with the capacity to complete all of the remaining RCRA corrective measures implementations. We will somewhat award those task orders sequentially as we go through and complete some of the work. So 2 task orders for 2 sites are in progress. The remaining requirements are expected to be awarded between 23 and FY25. And the goal is for the cleanup of the soils site-wide by 2028. Next slide. Okay. That is our progress. I know that was pretty fast, but that is our progress of the cleanup at Sunflower, again, which we started back in 2015. We have come a long way, as you can see from this particular picture here, 2021 to 2023, and we expect to be at remediation complete in 2028. And this is that map. You'll notice there are no colors except for the coloring of green, which that's land that is earmarked for Johnson County, and then the 2 universities will get the land that is identified by those 2 colors, pink and purple. Okay. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Could you just explain what the acronyms AOC and SWM stand for?
Yes, ma'am. SWM stands for Solid Waste management units, right? So those are units that there was a process that was done in an area of the site, and that process needed to be investigated to ensure that there is or isn't any contamination there. So the regulators came in and identified solid waste management units or areas that we had an issue, um, where we turned around and then did the investigation, did the cleanup, uh, and we are where we are today with those. And then the AOCs, those are areas of concern. The regulators, again, walk the site. If they notice any anomalies with the site, maybe a brown spot here, a black spot there, that's an area of concern that is identified, given a number, and we, the Army, would turn around and do the investigation, much as we've done with the SHMU. We do the investigation to identify what occurred there, and if need be, we address it with cleanup. Any other questions? Yes.
Who determines what level of cleanup in these different areas? Is any of it cleaned up to residential standards, or is it commercial standards, or industry standards, or some type? What determines that, and determines that it's cleaned up to that area after that?
Okay, so in general, the Army will clean up former military installations to industrial commercial. There are areas within that area, that installation, that may get cleaned up to residential standards. But in general, the Army cleans up installations, closed installations, to industrial commercial standards. We do, we are again governed by the statute, by law, and the Kansas law, along with the RICA permit that is given to us to execute the cleanup of the site. There are areas within that permit that requires you to clean up a particular portion to a particular level, whether it's residential and or commercial industrial. But for the most part, Sunflower was cleaned up to industrial commercial standards, and where applicable, based on the land use plan that Sunflower put together for the reuse of the installation, there are some areas that were needed to be cleaned up to residential, and we did that.
I've got a follow-up question.
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure about the difference between commercial and industrial levels. Is that the number of hours that an individual would be at that the exposure to industrial standards would be a detriment to
That'd be OSHA standards as far as that portion is concerned. But Sunflower was used for the production of ammunition powder, right? Propellant. And so that's an industrial use of the site. So the expectation is that you would clean it up to industrial levels, and then whatever comes in behind it for that use would be similar industrial commercial use, not necessarily residential. If that,
You want to talk a little bit about like exposure pathways, right? Because that's part of what you're up on. So like, I think what you're driving at is that for an industrial, like for example, if it was something that was being redeveloped for residential use, there are more exposure pathways where a substance could get into your body, right? So for example, if you're growing a garden, if you're a residential, a lot of people have gardens, or you have kids playing in the soil, right? There are more exposure opportunities for that, right? So therefore, the standard of how many parts per million or parts per billion, there's different substances we test for, right? Depending on what the site was used for, we kind of have a sense of what we're looking for. We'll test the soils or the water, et cetera. We look at what the applicable parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion in the substance is. And for a certain type of standard, you say, well, you have to clean up, let's say, 3 feet of soil, right? To make sure that, clean soil on top of it, if anyone was gardening on it or whatever, residential, you'll be okay, because the stuff you're really worried about is like much deeper, and therefore the chances that somebody could dig a garden like 8 feet, the odds of that are almost nil, right? If it's an industrial standard, usually you're putting like pavement or concrete, right? And building a building, you're not living there, you're only there for a short period of time, right? There's a lot of it's covered, so if there's soils that was the issue, there's not really an opportunity to get that stuff into you because you've got a layer of concrete or asphalt or whatever is a barrier between you and the stuff, right? So that's why the residential standards are typically more stringent, because there's more opportunities for bad things to get into your body. There's a lot less opportunities for bad things to get in if it's an industrial standard, because the nature of the reuse is itself a barrier for that material to get into you. I mean, I've been trying to, but so we obviously follow, there's different standards for different substances and different uses. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When they clean the soil up, what's that process? It's not the solution to pollution is dilution, is it? That you just spread it out?
Well, sir, in this case here, I mentioned about sampling underneath those sewer lines that we removed. If we find the contamination there, we will dig it out and then continue to sample until there's no more contamination at that particular point. Then we'll take that soil and it is sent to a hazardous waste facility. And then we bring in clean fill to fill the site and restore it, as you see in some of those pictures.
And then we post sample, make sure.
And then, right, and then we do, again, your post-sampling to identify what remains
Thank you.
and how much. And then you do have, KDHE, the regulators, they have promulgated standards on the screening levels. So we have to meet those screening levels for those various standards, either residential or industrial commercial. So whatever it is that remains, if any remains, will have to meet those screening levels. Any additional questions? Yes, ma'am.
Your microphone a little closer to you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
On your handout, you list the different sectors, like Sector A is 2,000 acres and 1,000 acres are transferred clean. Were the other 1,000 acres not dirty, or are they still being worked on, or?
Okay, so
Let's take.
you said Sector A, right?
Right, Sector A, for example.
Sector A is, where's A? Bottom. So Sector A, and your chart says how much acres was transferred clean?
1,120.
Okay, so this area here, light green and the dark green areas, that's the clean areas. These boxes that represents a response site, that is the area that is dirty or was used for a particular manufacturing process, and that's the area that we have to clean up. So that's the explanation for that number that you see beside those sites.
And then another question on the groundwater, you briefly talked about, looks like something more for the future. I guess what's been done for sampling of the groundwater, and what have you found? And I guess what's the plan going forward? And was there any sampling done of the streams? Because Spoon Creek goes through a big part of the plant, and then it turns, Kill Creek, meets up with Kill Creek, and that continues on. So just want to understand what's been done with the water.
Okay, thus far, we have done the soils, cleanup of the soils, and we continue to do the cleanup of the soils. Once we're complete with the cleanup of the soils, we'll get after the groundwater issue. We have what is called groundwater operable units, where we have divided the site into 5 different areas, and we'll investigate the contamination in the groundwater in those sites over time. We have started to do that work. We have a conceptual site model that was built by one of the contractors, and we'll use that to do the investigation as we go forward. The stream study, with the rivers and the creeks that are there, that will come at the end. Again, we do all the soils first, get that all taken care of, and then address the rivers, the streams, and the groundwater.
We're doing sampling of the streams in terms of the outfalls and stuff like that. You want to talk about that?
Right. So what Mr. Napoli indicated is, as we are cleaning up, there's those areas that are subject to runoff, during the rain event. And so those runoff get into certain areas, trenches, ditches, and things of that nature. And we will go ahead and sample those to ensure that whatever the contamination that was at, area X on the ground, in the soil, didn't leach out or run off into that location. And we just make sure that we don't have an exceedance of the screening levels or the risk levels that's promulgated by the Kansas state regulators.
So we don't really know what we're going to get into with the groundwater yet.
We have a general understanding based on what contamination came out of the soils that we found in the soil. So the analytes, the analytics, you take a soil sample and you analyze for a list of different chemicals. And if that's present in the soil, then we'll do whatever the remediation that requires for that particular contaminant, right? And if we find that same contaminant in the groundwater, then we'll go through a process to where we evaluate what the corrective measures are for that. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but the groundwater at Sunflower is not usable. However, we still ensure that there isn't any residual contamination from our process over the last 40, 50, 60 years that will leach from the soil into the groundwater. And if it did, then we have to address it. Any additional questions? Yes, sir.
You just mentioned the groundwater is not usable at Sunflower.
Yes, sir.
When was that determination made? Where would you find, it's not usable because of the chemicals in it that are in it, or what's behind it?
I believe that determination was made 20, 30 years ago. And yeah, but that's, yep. Sir, I want to take that question back and get you the specific answer. The understanding is that the yield on the groundwater at Sunflower site-wide is not high enough, strong enough, and the water may not be potable to the extent that you can use it for any purpose, drinking purposes, or even irrigation purposes. I'm not sure how that determined or when that determination was made, but it was made a long time ago.
Not necessarily talking about a well that was tested and said we can't drink this.
No.
You're saying just because the runoff, how it runs, topography, you're saying there's not enough runoff for it to be.
No, so if we were to dig a well, that well has to have some yield for you to even put it into use. If it doesn't come up, if it's only pushing out 5 gallons a minute, you're not necessarily going to use that source as a well water or drinking water source. So the yield on areas on Sunflower is low. And also, again, the potability, it's not good for drinking water purposes.
It's the probability side that I'm interested in.
Right.
So the production and what that groundwater is just.
And the groundwater is at various
Have they been
depths.
tested for the water at all? Is there tests you can look at, find what the makeup is of the water? Wells around here, or around the site?
Well, again,
Wells around the site, is there?
I'm not sure.
What's being found, because last time you were here, you talked about the water, the studies on the water are gonna be last.
Right.
And we're still in that position.
Yes.
It's coming up, but what do we know so far as to what's in the water?
Well, what we know so far that is potentially in the water, is that residual contamination from the processes that we have had over the years that we have already found in the soils, right? And so, again, those 5 groundwater operable units will do additional investigation site-wide for groundwater to determine what is there specifically and to determine our remediation efforts and how we go about addressing it.
You gotta answer my question.
No, that's okay.
50 years of cleanup, I'm just curious about the water.
Absolutely.
Pretty important.
But remember now, you
And the guy was he quoting specific guidelines for residential, like we only test 3 foot down? Because gardens grow roots a lot deeper than 3 foot. I was just curious, I know it's a detail, but I didn't necessarily follow the exact specification for your residential cleanup, or he was just throwing things out.
no, the specifications for the residential cleanup levels has to do with the standards and the screening levels as determined by the state of Kansas. Right. So whether we have to go 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet down to get to a level that is acceptable to within those screening levels, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any wells on any of these sites that you've come across?
No, ma'am. We don't have drinking water wells on Sunflower. The water that was piped in to Sunflower for use came from the Kansas River. So we do have a wastewater water treatment plant and a wastewater treatment plant that is at the site.
Just out of curiosity, are the 4 water towers going to remain?
So I don't know because those 4 water towers are now owned by Panasonic. Yes, sir.
At the completion of 2028, when the core is done, is the plan for KDHE to continue some sort of monitoring or presence on site?
By 2028, we expect that the majority of the site will be removed from the RCRA permit. And so once it's removed from the RCRA permit, I don't believe that the regulators will be actively monitoring the site. But the Army will have a residual monitoring requirement for the next several years after that. Especially if we do leave, say for instance, we cleaned up to the industrial standards that we talked about, and we do achieve those screening levels, there'll still be that little bit of contamination that we have to come back to ensure that it hasn't migrated, that it hasn't gotten worse. So we'll continue to monitor from that standpoint. Yes, ma'am.
Has all government funding for this been approved through 2028?
No, ma'am, it has not. Every year we have to request for funds. We identify the requirement each year and we request for funding And we'll know whether we get it or not by mid-year, most times.
Like the type of appropriations, like with the type of funds that are used for this type of cleanup, are what they call operations and maintenance funds, right? They typically are 1 year money, but they once they're awarded, there's a certain performance period. So there's like several years of funds in the pipeline, so to speak, to be, but we will have to periodically add more and program more to finish us out through 28.
But if Congress decides to cut funding, or make cuts, to save money, it could affect you guys.
Theoretically, yes. And Senator Moran, for example, he's been very involved at the site here. The delegation has been, paying a lot of attention. And we know that, and we regularly tell our Army leadership that your elected representatives are very interested in the site. So if we were to find ourselves in a situation where funding went sideways, like, we would let them know so that they could do whatever they had to do, So as of right now, this is a fairly high priority for us to finish this out. Now there's no guarantees in life, so theoretically, but we would let people know that, so it wouldn't be a surprise to anything.
The good thing is that the remaining contracts, and as you saw earlier, we had a contract that was awarded in 2022. We have enough funding on those contracts to do that work through 25. And then we'll go back to the requirements generation and identify what's required after 25 and request funding to address that requirement. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to thank you for all the work you've been done and staying the schedule that you stayed to it. So we all hope that you continue with that cleanup and the practice that you're using. And I appreciate you saying that Senator Moran has been involved in this, because we need to have help from our officials to keep this money going. So you just send him a thank you note. I make sure I will, but it's important to get that cleaned up for it not to stay at where it's at now. And I don't know, did you point out where that parkland's at? Did they see where the parkland, everybody might know where that parkland is.
The parkland? Which one?
The Johnson County parkland.
Oh, so if you look at any of these pictures here, especially of the map, the Johnson County land that amounts to about 2,000 acres is the dark green, which is essentially the periphery of the plant. And so, say again, ma'am? No, ma'am, that area is generally clean already. We had no process or production activity in those areas. And so that is considered clean. Except for the streams that we have to address the streams. And ma'am, our intent is to continue the cleanup here at Sunflower until we're finished. Any additional questions before we move on? You'll still have time to ask any additional questions. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, so restoration advisory boards. I heard there was a question about that earlier. And so want to give you a quick update on restoration advisory boards and how it affects Sunflower. Next slide. Okay, as it says here, RAB provides the community with opportunity to become involved in the environmental restoration process. It offers members the opportunity to influence cleanup decisions. And last bullet, because representative of the environmental agencies overseeing cleanup participate in the RAB offers members and the public to share their questions, concerns, ideas with the agencies involved. Next slide. Okay, so last year, January, February timeframe, we posted in the newspaper soliciting for RAB for Sunflower. The requirement is every 2 years, we will solicit for a Restoration Advisory Board. As you can see, we received 14 requests, 11 were completed and returned, but that response was insufficient to form a larger Restoration Advisory Board. Last year, we had a very high attendance at the same public meeting, but we didn't achieve the required expression of interest in forming a RAB. So we'll try to solicit again, we'll resolicit again in the January, February timeframe of 2024 for interest in a RAB. What we have done so far is to do these public meetings. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Is there any other way to post it other than in the newspapers, like social media, to gain
Oh, for the
interest?
RAB solicitation?
Yes.
Well, we did,
Some
We
of
did-
you,
yeah.
some of you will probably get a specific email from me when it's time again. Some of you may have gotten a specific email from me this time to let you know about this meeting. One of the things that happened in the beginning when we started having these meetings is we put the information in the newspaper, and then you folks came and some of you said, we don't take the newspaper, how are we supposed to know about this? And so what we tried to do is make everything associated with this a little bit more electronic. So obviously we have streaming tonight for that very specific reason. And also the emails that we have received, email addresses that we received last year, and also the folks who initially requested to potentially be in the RAB also last year. I have a list of those. So when we send this again, I will specifically send you at least those 7 people again to let them know that, okay, we're soliciting for the RAB. If you're interested, let me know. And then I'll send you the form. And you fill the form out, and that's how you end up getting on the list.
I think the answer to your question is essentially we'll try to use all forms of media to get the word out that we're having this solicitation.
Even if it came through the City of DeSoto's government Facebook page, a lot of people read that, so,
Okay.
yeah.
We tried to put this meeting on there as well, and so the city was good.
A lot of
It's
people
not-
are sharing.
They did
Yeah.
let us put something on the Facebook page, and we will try to, we'll request it to do that.
How many applicants do you need in order to form a board?
I believe the number is 25. 25,
It's kind of our initial
Yeah.
requirement.
25 folks.
It needed to be 25 individuals that were actually willing to participate on the RAB, and then an actual breakdown between community members and not just officials that were willing to actually sit on the board. So if the next solicitation we get actual enough community interest to form a RAB, then we would do so at that point. It's just been a struggle as Scott had mentioned that he has an email list of 70 individual participants to send out the request forms to, and we only got 14 initial responses and only 11 filled out the form. So a lot of people expressed initial interest, but were unwilling to actually participate.
Yes, sir.
Is there a deadline for that, already from the people, that is said, it's supposed to January, February, that is there a time frame for 25 people?
So what we'll do, and I'll commit to this now, what we'll do is when we send this out in January of next year, February of next year, we'll give an initial 30 days. And then we'll extend it for another 30 days. I think we do have some latitude in extending the period that we do the solicitation for. So initial 30 days, and then about 30 days after that. And then we see where we are.
Have you increased the number of participants on the RAB? Because back when my wife was on the RAB, there probably wasn't 10 members on it.
Well, yeah, again, it's expression of interest. So if you have an interest, a good expression of interest, I think the members on the RAB themselves amount to about 10.
There's a difference between the actual board members of
Yeah.
the RAB and then just members of the committee itself, participants within the RAB. So there's that actual willingness to participate as a seated or sitting board member as opposed to an actual just participant.
Right.
Okay. And the actual board members may be limited to 10.
Right. But again, the interest needs to be pretty widespread so that you can, when you identify those board members, folks in different areas can provide them with questions, issues, and then they can come to the RAB meeting with those questions and issues.
So we're interested in participating,
Right. So when we send back out the solicitation in January, February, you'll have the opportunity to make your desires known at that time.
Yeah, and you'll have an email address for me that you can send the request, and I'll send you a form. You fill out the form with just basic information, and then
Yes, sir.
I was on the initial one at the beginning. Not like it takes a lot of time. We had a meeting once a month. We had a meeting on right on the time. 20 hours, 25 would show up, the state would show up, the Army was there. And they were great discussions. We got all of that. We followed all the developments that they were doing. I'm doing the investigations. One time we're looking at maps, probably had 1,000 wells drilled. Monitoring wells, soil, whatnot. So it's up to us. At that last meeting last year in January, February, this place was packed. I thought for sure we'd get 25 members. I'm still.
Yeah, we thought so too. We
just amazed.
we thought so.
It'll never happen if enough people don't get involved. Simple as that.
Yeah, we had all the forms. Folks would fill out the forms that were back there. Yeah.
At the meeting, it's extremely easy. It was fun being on the RAB. We get it, about every 4 months, we get a bus and we tour the whole 9,000 acres and stop at all the sites. Got to discuss everything. I remember when we found out that all the buildings had arsenic around the outside, something we never sampled for. And the Army said, well, it doesn't apply because it was applied by manufacturers' directions, which means that it's not out of compliance. I remember someone said, well, the instructions must have been to take the caps off, kick the cans over, because they were smoking hot. It's like they were just pouring the arsenic around the building. But I mean, you get all the information. I mean, you see all the reports as they're coming in. You're always on the progress. I was on for 20 years or something, 15 years. It was fun. I mean, it really keeps you up to date, and you learn a lot.
So having said that, be on the lookout for the solicitation documentation in January and February. Yes, sir.
Put our email back here that it's gonna end up on your list.
if you
Well-
want it to, it will. If you don't want it to, then you can just say you don't want information.
Well, remember now, this is the public meeting. We want to ensure that, we have a record of those who attended today's meeting. But we will do our level best to promulgate the solicitation for the RAB far and wide in the different media in January, February timeframe. It may, but that's what we owe you guys, to let you know that we are soliciting for a RAB and give you the opportunity to decide whether or not you want to participate.
Yeah, I don't think it was well publicized this year. And I got a snapshot of something in the Lawrence paper. That's how I found out about it. And,
About the public meeting?
yeah.
On social media. I saw it 3 or 4 times posted.
On Facebook.
Yeah, we expanded, yeah.
Public meeting today?
Yes.
Okay, it was on the Facebook page, DeSoto's Facebook page.
Yeah.
It should have been in everything.
obviously all the local newspapers, and then the 70 or so emails that I specifically sent out with the hope that, okay, if you get one of these and you know your friend, that's your neighbor that might be interested, that maybe they're even, you guys share the information as well with each other on Facebook and that just hopefully.
Even social media, I mean, what shows up in your, I mean, all of us who are on Facebook, I know this thing, God only knows what the algorithms are, right? Like, I mean, I have like 450 people on my Facebook, and I think I only see the same 30 people all the time, So, and then, or you see them eventually, but like 6 months later, like, oh, that was wonderful. Like, yeah, it was 6 months ago. Like, wait, what? It's the first time I even saw it. So that's why we try to hit every possible thing, because you just don't know.
I thought we'd have a full house, so I didn't spread the word too much because I figured I'd have a hard time finding a parking place.
Okay, next slide. I think for the remainder of the slides, we sort of talked about, what the slides are trying to depict here. But we'll add the meeting presentation, this presentation to the website. Several years ago, someone suggested that we put a website, or establish a website for communicating with you folks, and we did that. This last bullet here, your feedback on whether there's additional information about the cleanup of Army environmental restoration in general that would be helpful if provided. Again, we'll have the next, go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Go back. Okay, so we'll have that website, once you go to it, back one more. You can identify, that you want additional information. My email is at the back there, as well as Scott Smith's email, the site restoration, the site manager. You can identify to either of us if you need additional information on the cleanup as it stands. And again, it's the website for everything that we do at Sunflower. We'll post all the documents there, right? We'll post the schedules, and we'll post the briefings that you just saw. Next slide. Okay, and that's essentially the goal of a restoration advisory board, is to provide you with information about the cleanup that we are executing at Sunflower. Next slide. Okay, so we have some questions here that we identified, and we sort of answered those questions. But I'll go ahead and also say that we will continue these public meetings on a yearly basis. And every 2 years, again, we have a requirement every 2 years to solicit for a restoration advisory board. And so if we are not successful in putting together a restoration advisory board, we'll still have the public meeting forum with which to, for us, the Army, to provide information on cleanup, and for you, the community, to ask questions in regards to our efforts to clean up the site. Here it says, we'll have some requirements for documents to be available for public review. Everything that we've done at Sunflower resides in this building at the site, building 229.
Is that open to the public?
It's not. So you have to get in touch with Scott, and you and him will have a dialogue as to what information you need specifically, and we will go about the process of providing you with that information. We are in the process, or we will begin a process to put everything that is in that building on the website. So, you'll have it at your fingertips.
Are there pictures?
Not a lot of pictures except for the ones that are, well, these pictures are going to be on the website, yes. But as far as the documents that is resident in that building, a lot of it is work plans, completion reports, a RICR facility investigation reports. Gentleman back there mentioned about seeing a map with hundreds of little dots with wells. So you'll have stuff like that. You'll have sampling results, right? And you'll have an identification within those documents of the amount of work that was executed at the site, to include, linear feet, square feet of piping and what have you that have been removed, soil that has been removed and disposed of, and the decisions that the Army and the regulators made in coming to a conclusion to close the site or to continue to clean it up. Next slide. And there's the email that I was looking for, just didn't go down far enough into the slide. Okay. Questions? Yeah, it's a pretty big email address. But it works. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to the water issue, so all this has been like focused on the soil. So when the soil is complete, it sounds like you're gonna sort of tackle the water. Do you have any sense of how long that would take or what that process looks like?
You're up there, buddy.
The stream study will take a year to 2 years to do. Again, like he said, we're sampling the water as it's leaving any of our construction areas right now. And, once we're done with the upstream work, or with up on the land work, then we will be sampling not only the water in the streams, but we'll be sampling the sediment in any locations where the stream where the ditches or whatever may come in contact with the stream. And then if there's contamination there, then we'll clean it up. And with the hope of that being done by 2028. The stream 66 should be cleaned up by 2028.
Yes, ma'am.
Land use change, say, maybe 15 years from now. What are the assurances to make sure that, so if you're going from industrial to commercial, and that down the road changes to residents, how would this information, what is the process of that? Would the Army step back in to clean up, or is that the process would take you to that?
Well, the landowner will have the responsibility to determine whether or not the site that they choose is suitable for that residential reuse. The only way we would come back in to the site after we have completed our obligations is if something is found that was missed before. Essentially, again, just for some fluke reason, there is a sliver of mercury that was found. We'll come back in to address that particular contaminant. Yes.
The jury requirement's just to bring it up to industrial standards.
Yes.
Just to amplify something we were saying earlier today. So normally, in our real estate documents, we include, like, depending on what level of cleanup we do. If there's an industrial use cleanup standard, and let's say there's a ground, like for example, ground, right? every deed we processed to SRL contains a blanket prohibition on the use of ground. Sometimes, and I don't have the documents in front of me, it's pretty common for us to state in the document what there's a residential use restriction. And those there's deed notices. That anybody who gets the property, they're notified in the deed that there was once explosives. So the intent of that is that those requirements transfer through with the land, right? So that in the event that, I don't anticipate this would happen, but theoretically a future, DeSoto leadership could change their zoning plan theoretically, right? And then, but even if they did that, there would still be these deed notices, these deed restrictions, and the title company for the purchaser would see that, and that's the intent of that, is to trigger the right questions, right? So it's like, well, it says here, this has got a non-residential use deed restriction. Like, I don't understand. How could this be zoned? Why are you selling this to me as residential when it says right here in the deed that you can't use it for residential? We put those things into the deeds specifically because all of us in this room may not be here to remember this stuff, right? So the stuff is supposed to transfer with the land, so that's the ultimate. And then as what Eden was describing is we have an additional thing we put in the deeds called a circular warranty. So we warrant in our deed to SRL that we have performed all the necessary remedial actions, but that if there's some reason there's something found later post-transfer, we have an obligation to come back to address it. If something we put in the land, then we have to come back. And we also reserve an easement so that we have the right to enter the property later on and do the work, right? And sometimes this can cause friction, because if somebody has subsequently put an improvement, like if you put a shed, on a piece of property that we have transferred to you, and the stuff that is the issue is underneath the shed, we may have to take the shed apart, to get after the contamination. You can't tell us you can't touch my shed. It's like, well, I have an obligation to address this thing. Now we'll try to dig around the shed, and then, if we have to move it, we'll take care to try to not, to try to prevent the transferee from using and enjoying their property. But, there's no guarantee there, right? So sometimes that creates a little issue, but we put all those things in these deeds for those very reasons, so that we have a permanent tether to our requirement or our obligation that survives with multiple property transferees.
Yes, sir.
Do you have a feeling out of the 9,000 acres, when we're done, how many of those acres will be suitable for residential? 10%, 5%, 50%, just.
Okay, so the best way I can answer that, sir, is, for instance, here. This was a response site, that little block right there. This blue area here is a response site. The areas between, this road and this block, that's clean. So if someone wanted to, that particular area there was uncontaminated, right? And so could be used, for residential purposes.
Is that the area where cattle were grazing?
I agree. Well, I'm sorry. The cattle have been known to migrate from one point to the next, graze. The cattle they do not pay attention to fences or signs.
Again, all these residential questions are assuming that DeSoto or Johnson County sold it for residential, right? So ultimately, your community controls that, not the army, right? So if the community feels like it's too much risk, even if the regulators say it's okay, we still don't want it, and that's up to you guys to decide what will be residential, what will be not us.
So basically, anything that's not in a little box with a number signed to it was clean. I mean, did it need anything done? Am I looking at this
Yes, sir.
map right?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
And what we did was, at the time of transfer, anything that we erred on the side of caution, like, we had to basically prove the negative, we had to prove that there wasn't a problem, right? And then if there was any question, we assumed it was dirty. And so we did two transfers to SRL. One was where we had a finding of suitability of transfer. We gave them the deed warranty saying we've done all remedial actions. The second, what they call a faucet, or early transfer, the governor of Kansas had to sign off on it. That there's some level of risk taken that we didn't finish the cleanup, but we promised we would, and we would follow the regulatory processes to finish that out, right? So everything that was like dark green, for example, and in between, those were the things that were clean at the time of transfer, that there was an actual deed warranty that we did all the right things. So there was about, I don't think what the exact figures were, but like, I want to say maybe 6,000 was clean.
No, 3,000
6,000
acres was cleaned, and 5,800 about acres were contaminated that needed to be cleaned up. Yep.
And then, so like, as he was saying earlier, those AOCs, those were areas where we didn't know for sure there was a problem, but there was some use of it prior that gave us a reasonable suspicion there maybe could be an issue. So like AOC, what was the one in the classification yard?
Is that 18?
Right,
AOC
that was
18.
an area where supplies and materials came into the site by rail, and they would classify them. Well, we had no records that anything spilled there, but common sense dictates that as you're unloading stuff, things could fall, all kinds of materials coming in and out of there. So the inference was made, like, well, maybe we ought to go check, to make sure that inadvertently over those decades, nobody spilled anything, something didn't leak. So that's why that was an AOC. Whereas some of the sloughs were things where we produced explosives, there was acid used in the process. I mean, that's where some of that is going to be in the area. So that's why it's a slough and not an AOC.
Yes, ma'am.
So I can't remember, were the areas you were looking at, did you do like an overall of 90,000 acres random sampling, or only if there was activity there where it made you suspect it was contaminated?
We started with, as you build the list, right? You start with the things you know you were doing, right? Then they go through like aerial photography, so we have some records, but our records are not perfect. Sometimes they'll do, like, there's a question mark, or, they'll look at aerial photography and say, well, and then we'll even do interviews with, like, former employees, So we noticed, like, I don't know the site instantly, like Ian and Scott, but at other sites, there'll be instances where you'll see that the soil is different, like just from aerial photography, like somebody cleared that, right? It looks different. What was there? There's nothing there now. What was it before? And we have catalogs of aerial photography that go back decades, right? So sometimes we'll go through the records, look at the aerial photography, and then sure enough, sometimes we'll find, yeah, there was a building there. It was connected to this other thing. And then we dig through more records and say, oh yeah, that's right, that was the blah, blah, blah yard, And then, so what were they doing? And so we'll go through that kind of iterative process to see, okay, let's go investigate that, And then there are instances, like the third type is like, and I think Ian described it, you're out there doing something else, and you say, why is that patch, like, why is there no grass growing here? Why is that soil like much darker than the remaining? Let's put a little pin in that, let's go check it out, And then there are the other things that the regulators find. Say, well, maybe we wanted to look at this here. So it's an iterative process of going through the site. I mean, you don't just randomly sample every 2 feet, and that's impossible.
It's a visual inspection that
You go through the
occurs.
site, step by step, try to understand what was going on here, what could have happened, And then some sites get added all along the way. I don't think we started at 96 sites in 2005. Things that have been added along the way.
Any additional questions? Anything? No?
In the intro of this forum, talks about SRL having to do an in-kind $32 million investment. Have they spent that money yet? Who is SRL? Who are these rich guys that are gonna get rich off of this development out here? You know, only pay $32 million for 9,000 acres. I mean, they got.
Well, sir, we assessed the site as for sale purposes at $141 million for the 9,000 acres. And what we did, I'm sorry, I take that back. We assessed the cleanup of the site at $141 million. We entered into an agreement, an arrangement with SRL that we would give them $109 million of federal funds to clean the site. And they were supposed to provide $32 million as payment, and we did a mortgage for the $32 million. They would use that $32 million to clean up the site. The $109 million was used and expended during a 6-year period. And then over the years after that, based on some additional work that SRL did at the site, you know, that $32 million of in-kind consideration cleanup was executed at the site. So essentially, SRL owes the Army about $18 million, $20 million for the remainder of the cleanup that has to occur at the site. So with them having sold some of the property, then we hope that at some point we will get paid that $18 million back.
We renegotiated, as they were, once they landed so SRL, Congress enacted legislation directing authorizing the closure and disposal of sunflower legislation. I think what year it was enacted, 94, 95, around that time frame. It said that the Army shall transfer the property to a developer selected by Johnson County. So we didn't do like a GSA auction, right? That's the way Congress told us to do it. Johnson County, I think, did some kind of solicitation, and I wasn't around back then. My recollection was I think they solicited, and that was the highest bidder or wherever they wanted. And then so we worked with the developer selected by Johnson County to the transfer. And after the 6-year period, the clock expired, we tallied up all the expenditures that the SRL did. And we looked at each expenditure to see, did the expenditure that they made credit to the mortgage? This took us years, it was a lot of it. And we calculated it out, as he had described, about 12 million, give or take, of their expenditures being credited to their mortgage. And then when they landed Panasonic development, they had to compete for that, right? And Kansas won that. In order for them to sell that 300-acre parcel to Panasonic, we had to renegotiate our mortgage with SRL so they could get a clean title. Right? And so we renegotiated it, so it's okay, well, I don't want to give proprietary details, but basically we get a percentage of their future sales and leases so that we get the cash. But there's a small amount where they are doing work out there, and then we'll give them a little, there's some credit they'll get from in kind from some sites that they themselves. And basically, there was all of Ian's charts here about schedules. There was a few sites where SRL wanted to get work done faster than we could get it done. We felt like they had enough capacity through Burns and Mackers through their contractors. They could get it done faster than we could. So we told them, okay, if you guys can do that, we'll credit you X amount to the mortgage. So we'll get most of the remaining mortgage for the taxpayers in cash, but some of it they'll actually get in kind. But we had to do a lot of work to get that mortgage renegotiated. And we were up against it. We were like days away from, I mean, Panasonic was putting a lot of, hey, it's just, it really didn't happen. We understood. That was why we worked like crazy to get it done. This meant a lot for the community and for the state of Kansas. So we wanted to make sure it happened. And obviously, we're not gonna get our money if SRL can't sell property. You know?
Any more questions? At the last slide?
And of course, the money we make, just as an aside, the money the Army makes, obviously the taxpayers, we reinvest that back. In other words, it helps defray the costs of all this. We obviously have to pay for that. But, so we're not buying bullets and bonds with that money. The money from property sales goes to reinvest it.
Okay. If there are no more questions, that ends the public meeting for 2023 for Sunflower Army Ammunition Plant, the former Sunflower Army. Thank you very much, folks. Oh, that's mine. Yeah, that is.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, that is mine. Fell off my waist.